Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's go to San Luis Obispo, California, and talk to an old friend of mine. You up for that?
I am.
Great. Wonderful to see you, Robert Schaeffer. Yeah. How long have we known each other? 30, 40 years, something?
Something, yeah.
You should know because it was all about your book, Warpaths. That's when we got acquainted because I thought it was the neatest thing I'd read all year. And
well, I'll talk about that some today.
Yeah, that's great. So Robert has been a professor of sociology at the Cal Poly is the name of the university in San Luis Obispo, California. And he's retired about a year ago.
I published a book this year called After Globalization, Crisis and Disintegration, which looks at some of the problems associated with globalization. And I thought today I'd talk about some of the contemporary problems associated with globalization. The contemporary problems like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the rise of authoritarian movements in Western Europe and the United States that are trying to restrict people's citizenship rights and stuff.
The anti-globalization move, right?
Yeah, some of it's anti-globalization, and some of it actually springs out of a partition and so on, and democratic governance in the republics. So let me just a quick first kind of brief overview. The good news is democratic governance in the United States and around the world has expanded over the last 200 years. And there's been three important political developments of the last 200 plus years. The first is the rise of the republics. And republics are governments based on constitutional or contractual law based on popular sovereignty. So the people create the contract. As Rousseau said, a social contract. And that was very different from the kind of arbitrary rule that kings and queens practiced before the republics emerged. So in 1800,
hold on just a minute, because now that the queen is dead, people are talking about what they're going to have next. And some people are talking about a republic, but I don't think there's any shortage of democracy in the UK because you had a king or queen. Right.
So they've done basically a half breed. That is to say, they have a republic-like government, although they don't really have constitutional law. They have they have a hereditary kind of law based on precedent of the past, but they have a parliamentary system that looks pretty Republican in many respects, but they still have the monarchy. So they're kind of a hybrid a little bit. But what happened in 1800, there was only one republic on the planet. That was the United States. France had created a republic, but then Napoleon came along, and that was the end of that for a long time. But since 1800, most of there's been independence movements, and countries around the world have become republics, so that today almost all of the 194 countries in the world describe themselves as republics. Now, they differ some. So the French call themselves the French Republic, and the Chinese call themselves the People's Republic, and Vietnam the Democratic Peoples. Those are the communist republics. Like the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics made claims to being a republic, and there's Islamic republics like the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they insist on a Islamic character to republics, but they still believe in constitutional government based on popular sovereignty. Now, there's some that don't. The monarchy in Saudi Arabia, nope, no republic. And ISIS was an anti-republican political force in Iraq and Syria. And the Taliban described themselves as an anti-republican state. They don't believe in popular sovereignty. They only believe in the sovereignty of God. So they're not a republic, and that's been a big blow to the Afghan republic that existed before. So the first good news is there's been the rise of republics. The second thing is that there's been a democratization of the republics over time. A lot of the first republics in Haiti and France and stuff were soon taken over by dictators and became authoritarian. So a strong man comes in, gets elected or whatever, rewrites the Constitution, makes himself president for life, and poof, you have a undemocratic republic. And many of the communist governments were that way. They were not very democratic, but they describe themselves as republics. But in the last 50 years or so, there's been a big democratization wave in Southern Europe, Latin America, East Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union, South Africa, the Arab Spring. And that has transformed many of these previously authoritarian republics into functioning democracies. There's been reverses
Hold
too.
on. I mean, we got to, you know, I know perfectly well you're going to say until recently. So you may as well build it right in.
Okay. So the bad news is
still going on because it's,
yeah. So in some ways, the death of the Arab Spring kind of marks the first real, revanchism, the reinstitution of authoritarian regimes. And there's a push across Europe by movements that would make themselves into authoritarian regimes, or as Viktor Orban says, illiberal democracies.
And maybe he got that from Fareed Zakaria. Yeah. I think he was one who said that word.
Yeah, so there's been pushback, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But the other thing that's important, so there's been 30 or 40 countries democratized in the last 50 years, and that's been a big plus generally. And then the last thing is the expansion of citizenship. In 1800, in the United States, you kind of think of a pyramid society. Only the top 10% of people actually were citizens, could vote, had the franchise, white, male.
When was that?
In the United States, in 1800.
1800, that was still true?
Yeah, there was 10%? Only about 10, 15%. So basically it was white, adult, male, Protestant, property owners with a lot of money. They could vote, and everybody else was disenfranchised. So the people who were exercise sovereignty in the republics was a very small group of people. What happened?
Actually, I have to say, I don't think anybody knows that. You've really told me something that's surprising to me.
The other thing,
I would not have guessed anything like as low as 15%.
But the other thing is that society and the structure of society was divided into three parts. There was citizens of the top, the minority, the white minority. There were denizens or residents in the middle. And denizens or residents are people who have some rights, but they don't exercise the franchise. They're disenfranchised to some extent. Mm-hmm. And that would be immigrants, women, and children. Okay, and then there's a third group below them who are subjects of either state or personal authority, and that's soldiers, convicts, slaves. Okay.
Very interesting.
So it's a three-level hierarchy, and what's happened?
Wait a minute, soldiers also couldn't vote?
Soldiers were subject to military discipline. Yeah, no, they couldn't vote, but they also, because they weren't property owners or anything else, they're also conscript. And of course, they were subject to military authority and rule. You could be flogged in the Navy or flogged in the Army. You could be shot for disobeying an order. I mean, they're like slaves with guns. Essentially, right? Sailors and so on. And so what happens over the next 200 years is a good thing. The thing has flipped upside down. So now most of the people in the republics are citizens, a majority. Women got the vote, African Americans got the vote, minorities, so on. They lowered the voting age so that more youth could become citizens rather than not, and many immigrants had a path to citizenship and so on. So that in general, there's a lot more citizens. But the trouble is there are still denizens, so immigrants in many countries, and undocumented and all these other folks. Minors, children, are still not citizens, although they can graduate into citizenship after a while. And there are, of course, still large convict populations in the United States and elsewhere. Their number is relatively small, but 1 million or 2 million subjects is a sizable number of people. There's also people historically who were subjects, people who were insane, so or mentally disabled, or seen as pariahs in medical terms. So people who had leprosy or typhoid, like Typhoid Mary, could be incarcerated without legal recourse because they were seen as a threat to public security. So threats to public health or security, terrorists and so on, are also can be treated as subjects, even now. To this day. So the good news, though, is that that's changed from this to this. So what's made all those things happen? Social movements. And there's been, there's basically three important kinds of social movements. There's been independence movements and labor movements and women fighting for suffrage from below. That's I call the aspiring movements. They're often helped by people who are citizens who might believe in the good cause. So abolitionists and men who supported suffrage and civil rights activists in the North and the South, white people who helped, join in common cause with Martin Luther King and so on. The Red Cross. I mean, there's the Soros Foundation. I mean, there's Bill Gates. There are people who help move people up. And then there's another group, and I call them the restrictionists. And these are people who want to keep this kind of structure in place. They don't want people to have or exercise rights, and they try to deny people who are immigrants, women, LGBTQ children, convicts, don't let them ever vote again if they're convicted of a felony once ever, So there are people, and they've existed from the Ku Klux Klan to the, to the Tea Party and so on. So those are the people that, generally speaking, have moved the, increase the number of republics, generally worked to democratize republics, and expanded citizenship in the republics. So those are all good things. But there's problems, and one of the problems, is dictatorships and so on, and the invasion of Ukraine, and that has to do with a problem that emerged in the republics after World War II, and that has to do with partition. So we're back to one of my first book. Okay, so to understand what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and the former Soviet Union generally, it's important to understand the history of partition. So after World War II, a lot of movements, this was a big upsurge in republics. Independence movements around the world were fighting for independence from colonial empires, and the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, and were fighting hard for that. And in that context of generally successful independence movements who are creating republics across Africa and South Asia and East Asia and stuff, there was a problem in some of them. And the problem was that some of the superpowers, the great powers, disagreed about what to do with these movements. And many of these movements themselves had competing movements fighting for control of the post-colonial state. And in those circumstances where the superpowers disagreed and where social movements were fighting, so you're thinking the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, or the communists in North Korea and the capitalists in the South, and the same in Vietnam and stuff, and Zionists and Israelis and Arabs and Muslim Arabs in Palestine, where those things happened, the superpowers decided to come up with kind of a solution, and their solution was partition. You divide the country into two. Each competing faction gets a state of their own, and everyone will be happy. Okay, that was thought to be a good idea. And it actually is still thought as a good idea.
Because you're really taking me in wonderful places. But normally when I think of partition, I think of the rationale for it is that they're different peoples, that they're different, ethnic groups like the Muslims and the Hindus or whatever. Yeah. But I guess not what you're saying is that a lot of these partitionist movements are cleavages between different social movements.
Yes, and the difference. Yes, yeah. That some of these social movements are ideological differences, like communists and capitalists and stuff. And some of them are ethnic, religious, tribal. So in India, it's Muslims and Hindus. In Israel, it's it's Muslims and Jews. In Northern Ireland, it's Catholics and Protestants. So partition sometimes, the cleavage is sometimes ethnic. And in other places, it's sometimes sort of social class or political ideology, communist or socialist versus capitalist and democratic or whatever.
Well, it could just be where the last war ended, the line of demarcation between the two armies.
Right, and sometimes they're complicated. So, I mean, Malaysia was not divided, but there was a civil war in Malaysia, an insurgency against the British in Malaysia, it was both ethnic, so it was Chinese, but it was also communist. So it was like ethnic and political, and that actually happens if you look today in Ethiopia and Sudan. The conflict is between Marxists, different factions of Marxists, but they're also ethnic, tribal identities. So the Tigrayans and the Omoro in Ethiopia and the Dinka and the Nur in Sudan, but they're all communists, or they're all socialists. I mean, they have they're different factions of the same ideology, but they're also different ethnic religious factions. So the idea, though, is you have these different groups that are competing and say, well, let's give them their own state and everything should be fine. The trouble is it creates three problems. The first is you get these incredibly disruptive migrations because you create a state and you say, well, we're only having people like us, so people move from the other country, and then there's some people who are not like us and you should go away, and so they move to the other. So you have these disruptive migrations. 17 million people moved across the Indo-Pakistani borders after the partition. Mm-hmm. The second thing is you still have people who stay behind. They say, we like it here, we're okay, we'll be okay. And then they're discriminated against by the new states. You don't belong here, we want you to go away, but you're still here, darn. And this is Modi and the Muslim population in India today. You don't really belong. You're not really one of us. You're not really, okay. And then the third thing is they dispute the borders and, the sovereignty of where our powers is. And they all actually really want the whole place. They don't want half of it. The North Vietnamese say we want all of Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese say we want all of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And so this leads to conflict and war. So most of the wars of the post-war period, the big wars, Korea, Vietnam, 3 Indo-Pakistani wars, 5 Arab-Israeli wars, troubles in Ireland, and a Cold War in Germany's. These are all, in some sense, the expression of partition. Then what happens is, of course, later, the communism collapses in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And in many places, that led to democratization, but it also led to partition, particularly in Yugoslavia, which divided. It was not divided by the great powers. It was self-divided. People got together or fell apart in the same place and began to battle again. It was they had a similar political values, but they had different. They decided that ethnic stuff was the way to go, and so they divided. And of course, they had all these problems. They led to war, migration, conflicts over sovereignty, foreign intervention. The whole deal. Russia's different in some respects. Russia actually, the constitution in Russia actually provided for separatism. Mm-hmm. That every republic of the Union had the right to self-determination. They never imagined that anyone would exercise it, but in 1992 they did. Mm-hmm. And so they said, we have a right to create our Ukraine and Georgia, Latvia and Lithuania, and they did. Now, you have many of the same problems in Russia. That is to say, you have these migrations because there's a huge Russian-speaking population in the diaspora outside of Russia. So 26 million Russians living in other republics, Russian-speaking Russians. And then you have migrations that are with that, or they stay behind and then they feel discriminated against by the Baltic states or by Ukraine or by other places. Some places they hold on to power and they're kind of the residual power. They're no longer communists, but they're now kind of ethnic in their way. And you have disputes over sovereignty and so on. Now, Russia, unlike Yugoslavia, is quite wide, and so people in Azerbaijan are not upset with people in the Baltics. I mean, they're a long way away. But Russia is involved, a central player, and it becomes involved in issues related to partition in neighboring states. It invades. It has Chechnya. They want to secede and become their own stuff. That's not going to happen. And so there's a big battle that goes on there for some years. And then Georgia is developing, like Ukraine has recently, a democratization and also alliance with Western Europe and NATO, possibly, and so on. And so the Russians invade Georgia and set up these sort of separatist states within that and recognize them as different. It's kind of the game plan that then is practiced then a few years later in Ukraine, when the various revolutions the Orange revolutions overthrow the pro-Russian governments, and then the Russians in 2014 seize Crimea and then support a separatist movement in the Ukraine, in the eastern Donbass regions, and so on.
Just today, they're going to try it even further with a referendum.
Referendum. Well, that's what they did in Georgia. They recognized these other non-Georgian, anti-Georgian ethnic enclaves, and said, we recognize you as separate states. Nobody else in the world does, but they do. And the idea is to detach them. And, turns out they're not going to recognize the independent places. They're just going to annex them. But okay. Yeah. But originally their game plan was to try to create these separatist movements. So that all comes out of this partition, separatist, secessionist tradition, and it does help explain some of the conflict and wars that have been ongoing in the former Soviet Union after the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's been a problem. Of course, these partition problems still linger in other places. China has been threatening Taiwan, which is kind of back in the thing. North Korea is if China invades Taiwan, will North Korea again invade South Korea? Mm-hmm. These are not unlikely scenarios. And the problem is, of course, is that those countries have nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the Taiwanese have never exploded a nuclear weapon, but they were always thought.
They have them?
Well, they were always thought. This is some years ago. The last I heard is that they're entirely capable of doing it in a very short time. Now, whether they have the stuff and they just, we haven't put them together yet. We haven't blown them up. Mm-hmm. But, they can do, anyway, this is an open question. I think I'm not sure that they do. They've kind of said they don't, but I'm not,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The South Koreans are the South Koreans in the same situation. They could develop a nuclear, they have the technology, they have the plutonium, they have all the stuff they need. They have to do it. How fast, under what conditions, not clear. But
see, I haven't heard anybody talking about this. If you bring those two countries up, probably there are 20 other countries that are in the same situation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Iran. I mean, we know about Iran, and we knew about Iraq, and the other countries that were trying to develop nuclear weapons. We knew about Pakistan and its attempt to do that. These other ones. How they certainly have nowadays. The technology is not that.
No, I know. Yeah.
Difficult.
They say a high school kid who's smart.
Yeah.
I mean, the only reason we don't have them all over the place is it's hard to get hold of the fissile material. Not that it's hard to figure out how to make them.
Right. And the thing is, South Korea, Taiwan, these places have nuclear reactors. They have all the material that they need if they wanted to. Now, they haven't expressed a desire to do that. So, they may be some distance from it, but anyway, that's a worrisome development. And partition generally is, and that's one of the problems with with Russia today, is that in some ways it's a recent expression of those kinds of problems that were thought to be solved by dividing countries into these multiple parts. The other thing is that we talked about is the resurgence of authoritarian movements and these kind of restrictionist movements, and this has more to the story here. Is the background is less about not about partition, it's about globalization. So there's been a resurgence of, as you know, let me just look around, of authoritarian right-wing movements in the United States, the Tea Party in Trump, Brexit in the UK, Le Pen in France, and the League of the North in Italy. Also, it's a separatist movement. um, Orban, the recent right-wing victories in Sweden, and so on. So there's a big upsurge in these movements around the world, and I think that, or the Western Europe and the United States anyway. And I think part of it has to do with globalization.
Well, and that's what I was wondering. What's your take going to be on that? Because I spend half my time lying awake at night worrying about those, that kind of thing, and everybody that I know talks about it in economic terms. Looks like you do too.
Yeah. So it's economic and okay, economic and also social terms. So, and this will take us back to the pyramids and citizenship and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the thing about globalization is that, it created expanded world trade and so on and so forth, contributed to the rise of dictatorship in China, outsourcing, the monopolization of companies around the world, the expansion of stock markets and stock price inflation. So the stock markets are booming and so on. But it also led to a series of problems. The first is it led to massive job losses and deindustrialization in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. Second, it created enormous, renewed increasing levels of economic inequality in those countries. So the rich got richer and the poor got poorer.
You include Japan. I had to stop and think there because I haven't heard anybody talk about Japan as suffering from that.
Yeah, well, so Japan has been actually, was the next coming power, and it's basically been stagnant since about 2000, and has been struggling with that. And Japan has responded to its various issues by outsourcing stuff to China and Korea and elsewhere. And so the Japanese economy has basically been kind of much more contained than it was during the boom years. Up until about 2000 or so. But what's happened is, so you get the rise of economic inequality, and then you have these enormous economic crises. 1987, the stock market crashed. At 2000, there was the dot-com bust. 2008, the Great Recession, which was in the United States but spread around the world. And then, of course, the COVID and Greater Recession of 2020, and now actually kind of a Russia-Ukraine war recession associated with the invasion. So what those things have done, though, is that they've created enormous political, economic problems in the rich countries, but also they create a series of crises across in the developing countries that were being globalized. So there were crises in Mexico and in the 90s, and then in East Asia, across Southeast Asia and South Korea and stuff, and then Russia in 1997, which led to Putin. And disaster. He's been in power ever since he took over after the collapse of the Russian economy in 1997-98. So it contributed to all those different kinds of problems. And the most recent ones, the Great Recession of 2008, led to the emergence of, or reemergence of, anti-globalization movements on the left and the right. People forget about the left. The left was fighting against globalization in the 1990s, which led to the battle in Seattle. There was a union of environmentalists and labor people and stuff. I was actually part of that.
Well, that's what I was thinking. You have to acknowledge that you were a ringleader of the whole damn thing.
So, and we were against the free trade agreements because we saw them as a threat to environmental protection and so on, and to displacement and other sorts of problems. So the labor movement, the environmental movement, were the first time it sort of joined in common cause. They were actually quite hostile to each other in the left for decades, but they started to get together around kind of anti-globalization stuff. And then it kind of fell off a little bit, but then after the Great Recession, it revived in Occupy Wall Street, and then the emergence of a left anti-globalization faction within the Democratic Party. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders years. They're talking about the billionaire class and tax the rich, and we are the 99%. And it was rooted in this kind of opposition to globalization, and then the resurgence of movements that were doing that. Now, so they've had their emergence too, but probably more important politically has been the emergence of the anti-globalization right. And that's the Tea Party, and then Trump mobilized them by attacking immigrants and saying it's immigrants that are the source of deindustrialization. He attacked China. I mean, he attacked everybody. He attacked U.S. allies and whatever else. But everybody was to blame for the job loss, deindustrialization in the United States. And he used attacks on other groups, both domestic and foreign, to try to build support and rationalize his attack on globalization and everybody else. Other movements in Western Europe, the same kind of things happened. Europe was was hit much harder than the United States by the Great Recession, and lasted much longer and did much more damage. And so right-wing movements in France and Italy and England and stuff basically said, well, they did this before Trump, but they started attacking immigrants and saying it's immigrants who are, disrupting the stuff. And what we need to do is restrict immigration, restrict their rights, make women, they can't wear the hijab. There's too many Muslims around, and so on. And that we have to get more authoritarian and more conservative in our approach. We also have to kind of get out of they attack the European Union as a political and economic institution, saying that we don't really want the euro currency anymore. We want our own currency. We want, we think we don't want to be ruled by a bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels and stuff. And so that is a kind of democratic movement, because the EU has always been a force for economic integration and equality. It's been a force for free access movement across borders and migration, within Europe anyway, of different groups of people, and has been supporting the rights of all citizens in the European Union to obtain its benefits and so on. And so these people are pushing back and said, no, we don't want migrants from Yugoslavia and in London. We don't want Italians in Norway. Okay, Poles or whatever. We don't want the Polish plumbers. So there's pushback against that, and there's you can understand some of the reasons if you understand the nature of globalization and the crisis there. But there's a real attempt now in the United States and in Western Europe by these movements to, as I said, restrict the rights of the denizen groups and citizens, to disenfranchise immigrants or women, or in many places LGBT rights are under attack. In the United States, abortion is under attack, so the rights of women. So basically, we want to deny, we want to suppress, we want to restrict the rights of citizens, denizens, and of course subjects. We're tough on crime. They should all go to jail for the rest of their lives. We should, kick out all the terrorists, and when anybody gets a parking ticket, if you're an immigrant, then you get kicked out of the country. I mean, that's the restrictionist push, and that goes back 200 years. They've been doing that forever to try to keep, and it's basically white people, protecting white privilege and power from people who would challenge or displace them economically or politically, and that goes back a long way. So to some extent, I'm arguing that both the authoritarian and the right-wing insurgents is a product of contemporary is created. The resurgence is created by contemporary globalization problems, but it actually is an expression of really long-term battles over the expansion of citizenship in the republics. And right now, they're kind of doing. They're pretty forceful. They're making a lot of progress. I think the fact that Joe Biden was reelected and was elected, and Trump defeated, was an important. Wait a minute, we're not going to go there, whatever. And the left did mobilize effectively, and the anti-globalization left, and the Black Lives Matter left, and the women's movement and stuff kind of got it together for that election. And that was an important break on that. But, it's going to be a battle.
Yeah.
It is a battle.
Okay. Wow. Well, you make a good case. I mean, you make a logical case. I just still have a problem with the packing it all in under economics. I did a sort of with back of the envelope. Well, I spent about 2 weeks trying to analyze everything I could on the exit polls from, I guess, 2 years ago, and trying to who voted for Biden and who voted for Trump and so on. And and even before that, who had supported Hillary Clinton and who had supported Trump. And the people who supported Trump were actually richer than the people who supported Hillary. And with the Biden exit polls, there was no correlation with education or income up to PhD level or something like that. The poor and the rich or middle class, there was no relationship until you get to $100,000 a year income, and then you would get more people voting for Biden. And there was no correlation with education until you got to a professional degree, PhD or a highly specialized or occupation in IT fields or something. There was a lot of correlation with the urban rural, huge amount there. Of course, there was an enormous correlation by race, black, white. I'm not sure I could see any. I don't think I had evidence about Latinos and so on, or other ethnics. But so nothing seemed to make a difference much except rural, urban, and race, and then cultural differences. Yeah. I mean, when you look at things like, gun control or abortion or the right to for transgender people to use whatever toilet they want, or gay marriage or things of that kind, stupendous differences. The people who were reactionary in terms of cultural values were vastly more pro-Trump than for Biden. So I really think it has more to do with a sense. There were people being quoted about rural people saying, "I know you guys, you city slickers, you think that we're dumb ass people and we don't know anything, and we're backward and so on." Well, we're not. We're with this kind of resentment of being looked down upon. Mm-hmm. Is, I think, the emotional motivation that matters a whole lot more than economics, and explains a whole lot more. Because I think I understand these guys who want girls to act like girls and boys to act like boys, and I can understand those people from growing up in Oklahoma until I was 12. Those were the little boys that were, vulgar little guys in my class, and now they're vulgar old men. So I think the resentment of feeling, not respected, and to me the real problem is that they're right. I mean, the urban, sophisticated, latte drinking, Volvo driving, the kind of imagery that they impute to urban, well-educated or professional people. the they feel disregarded or disrespected, and they're right, because I really don't respect them. I'm one of these people, and you are too, and we really don't respect these people. And I think the problem is I don't know how to respect them.
Well, there's a couple things I would say. I think you're right that the way that it gets expressed is in cultural terms, and the big issues for many people are not the economy. I mean, inflation now is obviously a economic problem, but that's not how these movements emerged. Inflation is a recent development. But the expression about gay and lesbians and abortion and women's issues and cultural differences and stuff, I think are what activate people. But it comes on this baseline. One of the things that people have done, sociologists have done some good studies of the emergence of the early Tea Party. Theta Skocpol, for example, and others have done very.
Well, I'm
stuff.
Close to Arlie Hochschild, so I'm very familiar with her book and love it.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is that what they talk about in the Tea Party stuff is that there's enormous resentment to the people above, the elites and so on and so on. And that's important to mobilize. But there's also an enormous animosity toward people below, what some people call the moocher class. That is to say, the people who are living off, we're working hard and they're just being lazy and collecting benefits, or they get a stimulus check and I don't, because I actually do make a fair amount of money. But I'm doing all the work and they're not doing anything. And then my taxes are going to pay for other people to live high off the hog or get student debt canceled and stuff, but I still have to pay for my mortgage and stuff. So they did actually find an enormous economic rootedness in animosity toward, in the emergence of the Tea Party and their resentments. And their resentments are both directed above, but also, on Obama and all that stuff.
I mean,
but also
you have to say more to the lower, because otherwise they would have resented Trump for being rich, but they obviously don't mind.
They didn't. And so what the genius of the evil genius of Trump is that he picked up on that. He also picked up on the fact that one of the things that they did a poll of Tea Party people back in 2010 or something. So, and they found that they had a lot of things. They were mad about taxes. They were mad about the moochers. They were mad about stuff. But they were also really mad about immigration. But the Republican Party didn't want to make that part of their agenda, because actually rich Republicans rely on cheap immigrant labor in California and elsewhere, and then fast food places across the country and so on. So they didn't want to make an issue of immigration. And what Trump did is he read he figured out what was going on in the Tea Party. People said immigration, that's a moocher class of the first order, and we go after them, we can just really. So he comes down off the elevator and he says, there's all these rapists coming up from Mexico and so on, and like boom, we need to build a wall. And that's what really galvanized and brought all these otherwise conservative, anti-moocher class people into his camp, rather than into the other Republican, Ted Cruz kind of, people. And that's what galvanized it. And then immigration and then other issues they found were very salient in mobilizing people. But you're right. Most of the people in the Tea Party, they found, those Tea Party people who voted for Trump were actually pretty well off. They're like, and particularly in rural areas, they own farms, they own businesses, they own, stuff. And they're relatively small numbers nationally, but they have enormous power in small states with 2 senators and so on and so forth. So they play a kind of disproportionate role in the politics. But you're right. It's not all, there's an economic underbase, as Marx used to say, but politics is not usually fought about the structural things that are going on in the economy, except at exceptional moments. And that's what the Republicans are trying to do. They're trying to get back to try to get down and get the inflation, because everybody's mad about inflation. So, that's going to be their pitch. And they used to play the culture card, abortion and all this stuff. But now that that card got flipped on them, and now they're having to say, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to make all the women entirely mad at everything, So, but they're willing to go do that. So
Yeah, because
but
I
I think you're right.
had a very brief conversation with Arlie about two weeks ago or so, and she was I had counted her as my main ally in my argument with people who are economic reductionists, if you will, if you won't be offended by
That's me. No, just kidding.
that's you. But she said, well, it's not an either or thing. It can be both. Okay. There can be some economic factors in it. It's just that it isn't clear to me how much. In fact, it's very obscure to me that there's much connection between globalization, economic deprivation, and the kind of resentment that we see manifested going on when people refuse to believe that vaccines work, or things like that. I guess hell, those people who are in favor of Putin, and who will accept Trump's praise of his buddy Putin. Those relationships are. I don't really get why some issues are bundled together the way they are, because there's no logic to me about why people who don't believe in abortion should be the same people who don't believe in gun control, and who don't want transgender people to use a toilet that they weren't born into using. And what's the connection? I don't get it.
Yeah.
But it's something like a desire to go backward in time and keep some kind of cultural stability that seems familiar, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I think there's always this nostalgia for the past that never was.
Yeah.
I would say a couple of things. One is that in Western Europe, the right and stuff, the kind of the cultural issues are maybe less apparent. I mean, I think the economic ones are more apparent there than they are in the United States, and the connection is more readily made.
But the connection to immigration, I think, is probably stronger there.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. They're both very strong. Yeah. And immigration, I mean, the thing about immigration is that it's a cultural, they're the wrong people. They're not us. They're a different religion or a ethnicity or origin or, a culture or whatever else. But it's also economic, because it's about jobs too. And also benefits. It's the moocher thing. They come here, they want to get benefits that that we're paying for and stuff. So we're being ripped off by these people in different ways. So immigration is one that's both is sort of pretty clearly economic and that cultural dimension. And the cultural thing actually makes it more, I think, makes people angrier, in some ways than the economic, or it makes it more flammable, if you will. And that can, that's easily expressed, for example, when there's, an act of terrorism. I mean, Europe has had a lot more, sort of ongoing acts of terror than the United States. And I think that, and it's obviously, it's related, there's a expression that comes out of the, ethnic communities there and stuff. So there's.
Well, I mean, it's true now that cultural differences get people angrier, but it certainly hasn't been in the past. I mean, when you talk about class warfare, when you talk about, Marxist or labor relations, anything having economic class conflicts were much more heated in the past than they are now. Now, when, you have poor people voting for Trump, and now apparently even, Mexican immigrants are moving in the direction of voting for Trump. That's what I read yesterday or saw on the TV yesterday, that they're moving in that direction. It doesn't make sense when, at the border, their brothers and sisters can't get in, and yet they're voting for Trump. I get it. They would vote for Trump today. So,
well, there's a brief point on that. So when I've done, so I used to draw this thing again, like another pyramid, and basically show that the movement, or it's like this, is that you have aspiring movements coming up, you have these altruistic movements that are helping them out, and then you have these restrictionist movements that are, trying to keep people down. And one person in my graduate student in one of my classes said, well, what happens with a lot of movements is like you have the labor movement, right? And they're aspiring, they're fighting the power, they win. And then they say, oh, we're going to discriminate against Black people and women. We don't want them in our unions, right? This is a union for white men, right? Mm-hmm. So they become restrictionists, and that actually kind of describes the situation you're talking about with Hispanics. So many Hispanics, either they moved or their parents moved to the United States, they're getting stuff, and now you see new immigrants coming and they say, oh, well, we don't want them, right? Mm-hmm. But that actually happened with Europeans too, right? I mean, we came, we worked hard, we survived, and then all these Irish people are coming in, darn Catholics, right? Okay, and that gets, so there's a way in which the aspiring themselves can kind of turn around to become jerks, and fight people who just like them were trying to get ahead, because they say, oh, but we're different. That's the whole thing. They say, we came, we worked hard, and we survived. We didn't get handouts, so we're not like them. They come, they want handouts. They have a different culture. They don't want to assimilate. They keep eating the same old food. They live in their little neighborhoods and stuff. We moved out to the suburbs. They're not like us, even though, well, sociologically they say, well, that's a view, but it's kind of a sense of denial too, right? Yeah. So that's part of the problem. So in the United States, people who move up turn against the people who move up.
Well, now there we have a real problem in terms of prediction, because the second part of your analysis is what I was hoping to get to soon, and that is, after globalization, what can we expect to have? What's the future? But if in fact you try to figure out, well, what say? Okay, there's going to be pretty soon there'll be more non-whites or non-Anglo whites in the U.S. than there are brown people, let's say, or Asians, or non-whites, and so we know that that immigrants and non-whites vote Democratic. So you can just count on it. We're going to see the Democrats in power pretty soon and unable to be contested. But then that, you start making that kind of prediction, and then these people completely flip on you and turn out to be different from what you thought they were going to be. Yeah. I mean, how are you going to predict what comes after globalization?
Well, I think, that's a good point. A friend of mine wrote a book, John Judas, called The Emerging Democratic Majority, where he was basically arguing that all the things, projected. This was 20 years ago. Well, that didn't work out so well. So I understand the risks of doing that. I would say, though, that you can predict what's already going on. I mean, you can predict in the future what is things that are already evident going on today. So, for example, if you look at Africa, if you think about globalization and Africa, Africa is falling off the map. Africa is disintegrating. It's being distanced from global. It's being unglobalized. It's being marginalized by economic, social, political developments, and that's coming from different sources. On the one hand, the post-colonial empires and states in Western Europe and the United States don't give a hoot about Africa anymore, and there's both economic and political disinterest in helping them. We don't need their stuff because they don't make anything that we really want or need anymore. They cost a lot of money. It's a chaotic place, and politically they just don't matter. President Bush said, Africa is not in our strategic interest anymore. Bye, so long, farewell. At the same time, you have a distancing from the and we don't want your your immigrants. So Europe and the United States say, no, no, don't cross the Mediterranean. We'll stay in Libya, get sent back to Africa. We'll pay you to keep them away.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a distancing going on. At the
Mm-hmm.
same time, Africa is very rapid population growth, and in some countries, and there's a sectarian conflict and war between people competing over scarce resources across sub-Saharan Africa. In the Horn of Africa, you have Marxists fighting Marxists in Sudan and Eritrea, and you have Christians fighting Christians in Rwanda and Burundi. The Congo has 60 different warring groups battling over. They do have some resources there, but it's the government has essentially collapsed in most of the region, and throughout these places, states are collapsing. There's not even republics anymore. I mean, Somalia and countries like that have no meaningful government, and the only services that are provided by NGOs, non-government, the UN, stuff. But that's just a band-aid stuff because they can't solve any of the problems that are dealing with that. So when I talk about after globalization, in some places it means disintegration. I mean, disintegration.
Mm-hmm.
Globalization or force for integration. This is going the opposite direction. Yep. And these developments have been underway for a while. It's not like just yesterday or the day before. We're talking about the last 15, 20, 30 years. And so, but now they're moving. And you can, if you're going to say what you think is going on, I mean, it's already been going on, and it's got a lot of momentum. So it's unlikely to change dramatically anytime soon. So I think that's a kind of prediction you can kind of make, because it's based on this, stuff. If you're making a prediction based on, how is inflation going to affect the elections? Well, inflation is a very recent thing, last 6 months, last year. So what's the effect of inflation? You can make predictions, but it's based on a very limited database, if you will, and there's momentum, but economists differ on whether it's going up or down, or so sure. I'd say that prediction is pretty risky. Other ones that are based on long-term, the water is moving in that direction, and the tide is in that direction, then I think you could say with more confidence. So, not with any certainty.
But you are pretty flat about saying globalization is over.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the momentum it had has basically been curbed by these crises and by movements that emerged in the United States and around the world against them. And the momentum to make and keep China growing and bigger is declining. There are problems with integration, supply chains, and all that other stuff. People are, what's interesting is that Trump attacked globalization by attacking China, free trade agreements, outsourcing, monopolies, and so on. But Biden is doing the same thing. He's actually continued that development. So that suggests that even in the birthplace of globalization, there are strong forces against it, and that they have some momentum. They're carrying through. There's an informal bipartisan coalition against globalization. People don't talk about it much, but I mean,
well,
the Democrats.
Okay. When people use the word globalization, you and almost everybody I know really mean economic globalization. Trade. But I think of it as cultural too, and it seems to me that in so many ways, the environment is clearly a global phenomenon. You cannot solve global warming without having some sort of international
absolutely
project. No way you can do it as individual countries, and cultural things too. I mean, right now, you and I happen to be a few thousand miles apart, but almost every day I do a conversation with somebody either in New Zealand or in Russia or in, someplace, Chile and so on. And it absolutely doesn't make a bit of difference where we are. It's completely irrelevant what country we're in. And, when they get machine translation a little better, because it's sure not very good if you try to get your Facebook posting translated into Russian. It's still a bit of a mess coming out. But, if you get that a little better, it'll be won't make any difference whether, what country we're in. Yeah. So I think that the cultural changes are definitely, international and transnational and have to be. So it's only the economies that are becoming nationalistic and idiots, politicians who got their head in the sand or someplace.
Well, I believe in integration in many respects, and good globalization as opposed to bad globalization. And I think there's a big difference. The most recent one has had some really pernicious aspects. Among them, contribute to the rise of dictatorship in China, and I don't think that's a good thing, frankly, for China or for people in the world. The other thing, though, I would say is that a lot of the cultural globalization is at risk too, with the China and the internet, Russia and the internet. Being able to communicate across the new walls, the internet walls, and separate platforms and stuff like that. I think that's a sign of disintegration, which is not welcome, and I think it's a bad thing. But I think it's a problem.
It is a big problem. We ought to have a whole show about that. And
there you go.
Have you back. We're over time. It's always great to talk to you, Robert. I just love to keep going another hour or two. So thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you.
All right. You take care. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Project Save the World produces 2 of these shows each week. This is episode 503. Watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there also about 6 global issues. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click.